Hi. Hello, everybody. So thank you so much for that introduction. A couple of the themes that you touch on there are really important to what I want to talk about, particularly the theme of community and what that means and how the way that we think about that changes over time. There are continuities from then to today, but there are differences that are also so significant that I would say they constitute some of the most important content for a historian to think about. What historians think about is change over time. And I want to start out by talking a little bit about what are the kind of changes over time that you can understand from looking at a diary like this. So this is a diary of somebody who's not famous, not a person with political power, not a person with an extraordinary amount of social power or influence, a member of the middle class of her day. And her life does not intersect, to the extent that we know, with any famous historical events. And so the question is, why would something like this be interesting? One way that people might think about it is that it just gives us a picture of sort of what things were like in the past, the old days, you know. And that can be interesting, you know, learning about the technology that people use, learning about the language they used, the clothing they wore. I think all of us who are interested in history, everyone here, is often brought to it in some ways by an interest in those things, by visiting this foreign country of the past where things are different. But I would say that the significance of a document like this can be much more profound than any of those things. And I want to talk a little bit about that before I get into the project itself. So I use this term, social history. And if anybody hasn't heard that term or heard that term recently, it is a particular school of history of looking at the past that especially takes off. Historians start doing what we call social history in like the 1960s and 1970s, is when it really, contemporary social history sort of gets its feet. And to this day, it's a very, very important subfield, or we would say a methodology, a very important approach to studying the past that's different from maybe some approaches that are more traditional or more conventional. So I want to talk a little bit about what that social history is, and then why some document like this that seems maybe humble or just of local interest, actually using the methodology of social history can be just as important as a primary source telling us about some really famous person or some really famous historical event. Let me go to the next slide here. These two images, I selected these. I love the way that these parallel each other, the way these gestures are the same. They both come from this kind of repertoire of classical gesture that would show up in 19th century painting. This is Patrick Henry addressing the Virginia House of Burgesses. And this, you know, apocryphally stating, "Give me liberty or give me death." This is the kind of thing we tend to think of as a historical turning point, an important historical event, right? This individual taking a decisive action, influencing other people at a critical moment in the past in a way that has readily understandable kind of effects, right? This is a historical event. This is not a historical event in the conventional understanding. This is a painting from the 19th century depicting a woman who has purchased a bonnet, and this is her father looking grim and anxious about the bill, right? This event is extraordinarily important. As an individual thing, right, this individual woman, it might not be that important, except in the life maybe of this family or whatever problems this causes this particular family. But this represents something very profound. That's the reason that a person chose to paint this scene, decided this was something worth commenting on. This is a house in which until very recently, the expectation probably was that if you wanted a bonnet or something like that, you'd make it yourself, right? And it might be handed down. Purchasing this, going to a store to buy this, represents something very significant, something really profound about the change from one mode of life, one mode of existence to another, one paradigm of society to another. And the transition represented here, I will say without reserve, is as important as the transition represented here, the transition of the American Revolution. And I want to talk a little bit about what is this transition? Why is it meaningful? And how can Mary Brainard's diary help us to understand it? Because that is the sense in which I find this diary to be so significant. So the transition that this image might be said in a somewhat vulgar and simple way, possibly to represent, is the transition from a pre-capitalist society to a capitalist society. This is a major topic debated by historians, the topic of the so-called transition to capitalism. No problem. So the idea of there being a transition to capitalism might be a slightly weird idea or a slightly novel idea, because we think that American society is in some ways always a capitalist society. It's always a society of entrepreneurship and competitiveness, right? The people who settle at Jamestown settle there with the intent of making money, and the people who settle at Plymouth are also engaged in mercantile activities. So it seems weird to say that America ever experienced a transition to capitalism. So I want to dig into a little bit what that means. And it might sound, I guess, a little bit abstract or theoretical, but again, this is about how people live, what people's lives are like in the most basic sense, the kind of foundation of people's existence in which events then take place. And by talking about the diary, I'm hoping that we can connect this maybe seemingly abstract question of a transition to capitalism into a very intimate level, into a local level, seeing how this world historical change from one kind of civilization to another is reflected at the very intimate level of people who lived right around here, lived through it, and documented it. So when I talk about capitalism, which is still, it's the system that we are all living in, it's the system that defines our lives. It's a system in which individuals sell their labor in a marketplace. Most individuals work for wages, and they also obtain the things that they use. More and more of the things that they use in their lives, they obtain on a marketplace. They exchange money for those things. That is different from a world in which, as many people in early America did, people produce most of the things that they need and use themselves. They make them themselves. They sell few things and they buy few things. Most of the things that they use to sustain themselves are the things that they grow out of the ground, the things that they manufacture in their households, okay? And they do engage in trade, but that's a small part of their lives, compared to what it is in our lives now, where almost everything that we use we acquire through some form of trade. The money that we use to sustain ourselves, we trade our time, our labor for that. The products that we need to sustain ourselves, with that money we obtain through the marketplace, through market exchange. There are big differences in what life looks like when you are relying primarily on your own labor and on the relationships that you have maybe with your neighbors and their labor, and when you are relying on a marketplace. And this diary is going to tell us something about that precise change. So I want to introduce you now to the characters of the diary. And I'm going to change slides so we can maybe locate them. So not this, but this. And then we're going to go back there for a minute. So this is a historic map. This is the best we were able to find these folks. This is Saratoga. This is the Brainard farm, and this is the farm of the Gaylors, who are going to come up a little later. But let's talk about the Brainards right now, the kind of life they lived, and the very significant ways in which it was different from how some people were living here, a place that is so nearby, but in some ways is like a world away in this moment in history, and yet not. We'll see what I mean by that. So, at the time that Mary Brainard wrote this diary, which is written in the year of 1910, Wilton was a town of about 900 people, significantly smaller than it is today. She lives with her husband, John Brainard, and then in this sort of household compound that they live in, her nephew, John Winnie, his wife, and their children also live. And John Winnie farms on land that he rents from Mary Brainard and that she eventually gives to him. So they're living, these are these two households that are living in kind of a shared situation. They're living on kind of a single farm that's divided between these two families, okay? Now, we can see the record in this diary of how they lived. That's what's so useful about it. The diary can seem, when you're transcribing it, as I did, to contain a lot of stuff that's really mundane, right? It's day to day to day, describing what they did, describing the activities within the household, and it also leaves out some things that you might really expect to hear about. She mentions certain news items that catch her eye, and then there are other things that we know about that were going on at the time that she doesn't take much interest in. The main content of the diary is this day-to-day stuff about what the people in these households did. And when you're looking at that up close, it can seem, again, not that significant or not that interesting, but when you zoom out, when you analyze it, break it up, look at it again, try to find patterns in it, you start to see a significant story that emerges out of this day-to-day stuff. So one thing that is really interesting about how they live day-to-day is they're living in 1910, right? 1910 is a long time ago, but it is very much in the modern era, right? We're not talking about the 18th century. We're not talking about, the world of the founders or the colonies. We're not talking about, even the world of Daniel Boone. We're talking about a relatively contemporary time, an industrial time, a time when there are many of the things that define the modern world exist. And yet, in this household, right around here, in many ways, people are living in a way that seems to have a lot in common with way longer ago, right? With even back to the 18th century. These two families do a lot of things for themselves and a lot of things for each other. A lot of what they're eating is coming out of a vegetable garden. They're even, going out and gathering berries. And that's not just like, the gathering berries is not like a recreational activity. That's a serious way of sustaining oneself. okay? That's something that is really important to them. They are making their own clothes. People in 1910 are making, she makes most of her own clothes. Now, she has to buy the fabric, but to her, the idea of going to a store and buying a dress would have probably seemed like something of that girl buying the bonnet. She would have had a similar reaction to that. That would be something really extravagant, right? Most of, they're trying to rely as much as possible on their own labor. Now, it's a commercial farm, right? It's a business. It's a business. But there's a lot of stuff going on that farm that looks more like the kind of subsistence lifestyle that people would have lived even 100 years earlier, okay? Or even 100 years before that. There's this long tradition of providing for yourself, relying on the stuff you produce yourself that's still alive that recently in this community right here. And what's really interesting about it, what really interested me is when I started to look outside of the household, outside of this compound, and look at how they interact with their neighbors. That's a lot of what she records, is how they deal with their neighbors. And you find that they're dealing with each other in a way that is really different from how people might deal with their neighbors today, even in a place like Wilton. Now, I agree, Wilton and a lot of small towns are very neighborly places, right? People cooperate, people help each other out, people volunteer, that's really important. But the way that it is today does not quite compare to the way that it was in 1910. Because in 1910, that was basically how everything worked. If you wanted to get work done, if you needed help with a task, you did not hire somebody to do that. There was bartering and exchange of labor between neighbors was how really important stuff got done. Not just helping someone out once in a while or being a good neighbor, but this was the substance of daily life. So John Winnie and Seymour Linendahl. These are, John Winnie, again, is that nephew living in this compound. Seymour Linendahl lives nearby. And they have this really important relationship where, you know, John Winnie needs to thresh wheat. He needs to do this arduous task of threshing wheat. Today, that task would, well, today it would be performed by machine mostly, but to the extent that it required human labor, those would be people who are paid, right? You don't ask your neighbor to come and do this task that takes days and days and is like super hard, arduous work, right? But in this case, he did. Seymour Linendahl does this work for John Winnie with no mention of any money ever being exchanged, with no mention of him getting a share of the wheat or anything like that. Instead, you get to see, if you read the diary closely and pick out this pattern, how he gets paid back. And how he gets paid back is that John Winnie then does things for him. He butchers his pigs, he mows the hay on his land, he does a variety of tasks for him. So there's this exchange of tasks back and forth. Again, no money changing hands, no strict accounting of exactly how much these things are worth economically, but a kind of institutionalization of neighbor helping neighbor that actually is sort of the bedrock of how things get done. That's one of the things that I'm saying you could call pre-capitalist. I'm not trying to romanticize this way of life or condemn a capitalist way of life. I'm trying to observe a difference. Now, their lives were really hard. We're going to talk about like why people might not want to live this hard kind of life. But they're really different in this way that so many of the things that we think are kind of your business to take care of as an individual, and you take care of it through going into the marketplace and exchanging money, they took care of as a community through relationships. And you can see how moving from that world to the kind of world we live in now is not a small change. It's a major change in the whole way that you think of yourself, the whole way you think of your relationship to other people. I want to read one passage that I found really beautiful in the diary. There are these moments where there is a kind of poetry that comes out. This is one of them. This is from June 27th, 1910. She writes, "A swarm of bees came and lit on a limb of the little tree by the doghouse about 10 o'clock. Johnny, which she uses to refer to John Winnie, came in from the cornfield, went over to Ireland's for a hive, got a lot of them in. Then they all came out, started to go in the tree again. He went down to Dave Easterbrook's for another hive, got one with some comb in it, and they did not think they would stay then, but started to go away, and John Brainard and John Winnie drove them back with water and sand. Then they lit on a post in the hen yard, and then they smoked them in. So all these people were involved in this, right? They go to one house to get this hive. There's these two families, they cooperate. They go to this other house to get this hive, then that hive doesn't work, then they go and get another hive. All of these people, you can see the density, the closeness of these relationships. They all are cooperating on this task. And remember, again, this isn't recreational. This isn't, having a beehive is not a hobby. This is a really important way to supplement one's subsistence when the margins of subsistence are really, really thin, when you don't have a lot to spare, okay? So to me, that gives this really vivid picture of kind of what this community is like. But now I want you to remember that this is 1910, right? This is the modern world, so not everywhere is like this. There are a lot of people who are living lives a lot more similar to the way we live now. A lot of people in here, right? In Saratoga. Now, interestingly, the Brainards lived in Saratoga earlier. There was farmland in Saratoga. They lived in a farm area in Saratoga. Then they came out here. But there also is in Saratoga at this time. It's not just we know about Saratoga in the late 19th century. It's, it's the spa town. It's the summer place. But it's also a factory town at this time. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to go back one slide. So we're going to look at this. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. So this was called the Clark Mill, later the Van Ralt Mill. It's currently at the corner of Excelsior Ave and High Rock. It is a textile mill in various capacities. They make different things. It starts out making silk gloves. It's made a variety of things over the years. It continued to operate well into the 20th century. It's recently been renovated. This is it in its present form. This is it as it would have looked from the exterior around the time that the diary is written, and this is what it would have looked like in the interior. Okay? And this is right next door, right? People working in factories, working for wages, living such a different life from the life that Mary Brainard is living. But these worlds aren't totally disconnected. Nancy Gaylor, she lived on that other farm I marked with the X. Nancy Gaylor worked in this factory. She's Mary Brainard's cousin. She grew up in Wilton, and then she went to Saratoga to work in this factory. And she's not the only person who did that. She's not the only person who did that. Now remember, I was talking about change over time. Transition, change. And the change we're basically seeing in America at this time, broadly defined, is fewer and fewer people living that kind of life we described earlier as Mary Brainard living, and more people living this kind of life. Okay? And one way that's reflected is in the census. In 1880, now the population of Wilton was obviously way smaller both these times than it is now, but it is a very different, as a farming community. In 1880, the population was 1,118. It had declined to around 900. This is part of a national trend of what is sometimes called farm to factory migration. Children are not staying in these towns to take over farms. They're choosing instead to go to the nearest city or big town, work for wages, often in a factory. And we also see that there's a change even within the community of Wilton. There's a big decline in the percentage of heads of household who list their occupation as farmer in 1880 and those who do in 1910, even within Wilton. People are moving out of farm work into working for wages. There are a lot of reasons for this. Some of it has to do, these are relatively good years for farming. This falls within the period that's sometimes called the golden age of agriculture. But nevertheless, it's an era when agriculture is competitive, when more technology is getting involved, debt remains a problem. And also, a bigger thing is that the contrast between the kind of life on the farm that we just described and the kind of life you live in Saratoga has gotten so dramatic at this time. What's so interesting about this is it's almost like we're seeing two worlds, two periods of time in overlap, right? I pointed out that that life in 1910 that Mary Brainard's living is in so many ways like a life that somebody could have been living in 1810, right? Still in 1910. But by 1910, there are lots of people who are living lives way more like our lives. So that's a huge difference to have within not only a single country, but within like a single county, between people who almost seem to be living in different periods in time. So you can see how children growing up in a community like Mary Brainard's might feel left behind. They might feel like the world that they live in is not up to date, and they might desire a lifestyle that they regard as being more up to date. And I think that that is what is going on with Nancy Gaylor, who moves to work in this factory, and she marries a gentleman named F. Butler, who is a construction worker. But she doesn't totally lose her contact with the community. And this is, again, that transition, that in-between stage. Mary Brainard goes to visit her cousin regularly, and actually, they still own, there's actually two houses. The way that they're owned is complicated, but the Brainards still own property in Saratoga from the time when they lived there. And when they want somebody to do work on that, they don't just go out and find a random person. They hire their cousin, Nancy Gaylor's husband, to do that work. And they maintain friendship with him. And when they need to repair something on the farm, they go and visit him to borrow his tools. So in some way, even though they're living in this really different world, there's this contact, there's this overlap, there's this way in which they still belong to that kind of culture of neighborliness and helping each other out in community. Okay? And we can see that across even greater distances. There's this family, the Thorns, who are friends with the Brainards. Actually, I have a very distant relationship with them also by family. There's a trace, it's a very complex relationship that I won't go through, but they're friends, they're neighbors. And the Thorns move as a whole family to Reading, Massachusetts, where the sons are going to work in a rubber factory in Reading, Massachusetts. And the elder, Jess Thorne, who has a large farm, it's one of the bigger farms in Wilton, he leaves his farm to go with his sons, to be supported by them in Reading, Massachusetts. You can think of this transition, how different this is. This is a guy in his old age. He's lived his whole life in the kind of world we started out by describing. That's what he knows. He's going to this factory town. All of his sons are going to leave farming and go into factory work. It's a big, big change. He tries to hang on to his farm back in Wilton, and he tries to do it by, again, engaging in this kind of culture of neighborly reciprocity, of working together and helping each other out. He asks John Brainard if he will pay the taxes, the property taxes on that farm, if he lets John Brainard take the hay off the farm, mow the hay off the farm. He'll give that to John Brainard. Again, it's not payment changing hands, it's help, it's a relationship. And so John Brainard does that. And then one entry towards the end that I find beautiful, that I'd like to read and kind of wrap things up, is that on October 26, in 1910, Mary Brainard writes, John ordered 8 cases of spring water to Jess Thorne this morning. So this is water from the spring in Wilton, the mineral springs in Wilton. They put this in bottles and send it to Reading, to the factory town in Massachusetts, where this man is living out the last years of his life, wanting to renew himself with this taste of home. This is a moment that, to me, illustrates the human dimension of this transition, this transformation taking place in American society. And it's things like this that make it so that a document like this that might be of local interest, genealogical interest, is also way more than that. It's also something that shines a light on some of the most important developments in American and indeed in world history and what they really mean in people's lives. And we can see that story right here around us, and it still continues. So thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
So do you have a hypothesis about why she was motivated to write this?
This is one of the most interesting questions in a way, and it actually takes some very deep reflection, I think. It shows something about the culture of the time, because it's not unique. There are many people wrote diaries that followed the same kind of formulas that her diary followed. But we might be surprised by some of the things she remarked on, and how little there is like what we would think of as personal expression or description of emotion or description of ideas. Very little of that. It's like an account. It was considered important to keep an account of daily activity, a record of what you did that day in a very simple form. And the tradition of doing that in America, I think in some ways it has roots in religion. It has roots in the idea of trying to give an accounting of your life. It's a very interesting document if you read it in that way, and if you think about what motivated her to sit down every day and just record these details, showing us very little of herself except for one or two sort of slightly emotive or poetic lines. She ends the diary by saying, "Goodbye 1910, you are gone, never to be seen again in this world," which I found, it's humorous, but it's also beautiful, and it has and it's one of the most expressive lines in the diary, and that is where the title for the talk came from. Thank you so much. Thank you again.